What if the one thing that could shatter a billionaire's iron control wasn't a stock market crash or a hostile takeover, but a $20 necklace worn by a waitress? For 30 agonizing years, Eleanor Vance had existed in a gray fog of grief, mourning the daughter who had vanished from their gilded world like a whisper in the wind. Her son, Julian, a titan of private equity, had built an empire of ruthless efficiency, a fortress of steel and glass designed to wall off the gaping wound of the past. He controlled everything, because once he had controlled nothing. But on a crisp autumn evening in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, a place where fortunes were made and broken over seared scallops and vintage Bordeaux, time didn't just stop, it shattered. An old woman's hand, frail but possessed of a shocking strength, shot out and clamped down on the wrist of a young waitress. A single ragged question cut through the low hum of power dining. "Where did you get that?" And as the billionaire's gaze followed his mother's, fixing on the simple silver locket at the young woman's throat, the carefully constructed edifice of his life began to buckle, and a secret buried for 3 decades started to claw its way toward the merciless light. Clara Mayhew understood the geography of invisibility. At 24, she was a master of the art. Her life was a meticulously choreographed ballet of efficiency performed within the opulent confines of Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a reputation. She navigated the narrow channels between tables laden with crystal and linen, her movements economical, her presence a fleeting suggestion. She was the ghost who refilled your water glass, the whisper that announced the specials, the silent hand that cleared away the remnants of a $1,000 meal. In a world of titans, invisibility was survival. It was her shield against the casual cruelty of the supremely wealthy, the dismissive waves of hands that wore more on one finger than she earned in a year. Her life outside these hallowed walls was a different kind of meticulous. It was the smell of lubricating oil and old brass in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, a space she shared with her foster father's legacy, a collection of half-repaired clocks and delicate watchmaker's tools. Daniel Mayhew, the only father she had ever known, had been a horologist, a man who found solace in the intricate dance of gears and springs. He'd found her, a swaddled infant left on the steps of a church, and had given her a name, a home, and a singular, focused passion. "Everything has a story, Clara," he used to say, his loupe pressed to his eye. "You just have to be patient enough to see how the pieces fit together." He had been gone for 2 years now, and the quiet ticking of the clocks he'd left behind was the only heartbeat in her life that felt constant. On that Tuesday evening, the controlled chaos of Aurelia's dinner service was at its peak. Clara moved with her usual grace, a phantom in a starched black apron. She delivered a bottle of Chateau Margaux to table 4, took a hushed dessert order from table 6, and then turned her attention to table 9, the most coveted booth in the house, nestled in a discreet alcove. It was occupied by the Vances. Even a ghost knew the name Vance. Julian Vance was less a man and more a market force. His firm, Vance Capital, consumed corporations with the chilling precision of a shark. His face, all sharp angles and icy blue eyes, was a regular feature in the Wall Street Journal, always accompanied by headlines of conquest. Seated opposite him was his mother, Eleanor Vance, the family's reclusive matriarch. She was a woman of severe, fragile beauty, draped in pearls and a palpable sorrow that seemed as much a part of her ensemble as her Chanel suit. Clara approached the table, her small, practiced smile firmly in place. "May I offer you coffee or dessert this evening, Mr. Vance?" "Ma'am?" Julian didn't look up from his phone, his thumb swiping through data with a predator's focus. He grunted something that sounded like a refusal. It was Eleanor who lifted her head. Her gaze was distant, clouded with the permanent melancholy that clung to her like expensive perfume. Her eyes, a faded cornflower blue, drifted over Clara's face without really seeing her. And then they stopped. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The ambient clatter of the restaurant seemed to recede, funneled into a dull roar. Eleanor Vance's eyes, no longer vacant, snapped into sharp, brilliant focus. The focus was not on Clara's face, but on the hollow of her throat, where a small silver locket rested against her skin. It was Daniel's first gift to her, a simple, unadorned piece he said was with her when he found her. The old woman leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the damask tablecloth. Her lips parted, forming a silent O. "Ma'am?" Clara asked, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. This was a breach of the unspoken contract. She was to be invisible. She was not to be seen. Not like this. Not with an intensity that felt like it could strip the flesh from her bones. Julian finally glanced up, his brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. "Mother, what is it? We have a call with Tokyo in an hour." But Eleanor was in another world, another time. Her eyes were locked on the locket. It was a celestial map, she knew. A delicate etching of the star chart from a specific night, a specific moment in time. The night her Amelia was born. Her husband had commissioned it, a one-of-a-kind piece for their one-of-a-kind girl. Before Clara could process the unnerving scrutiny, Eleanor's hand shot across the table. Her fingers, surprisingly cold and strong, closed around Clara's wrist. The touch was a jolt of ice and fire. "Where?" Eleanor whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, vibrating with a terrifying mix of disbelief and ferocious, desperate hope. "Where did you get my daughter's necklace?" The question hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Nearby conversations faltered, heads turned. Clara stood frozen, a silver coffee pot in her other hand, suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. She tried to pull away, but the old woman's grip was like a steel trap, forged from 3 decades of loss. "Mother, for God's sake, what are you doing?" Julian's voice was a whip crack. "Let the girl go. You're causing a scene." He started to rise, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. But as his gaze shifted from his mother's frantic, tear-streaked face to the waitress's shocked one, his own eyes fell upon the locket. He didn't recognize it. It was just jewelry. But then he looked, truly looked, at the young woman wearing it. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the slight wave in her dark chestnut hair, the scattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose. And then he saw her eyes, a deep, clear hazel, flecked with gold. His sister's eyes. Amelia, a ghost of a memory, locked away in a vault of willful forgetting, suddenly broke free. Amelia, age 17, laughing as she argued with him in the library. Those same hazel eyes flashing with a rebellious fire he'd both envied and despised. The blood drained from his face. The world which he commanded with absolute authority tilted violently on its axis. The fortress he had so carefully constructed around his heart didn't just crumble, it was obliterated. The past wasn't buried. It was standing 2 feet away from him, holding a coffee pot. "Amelia," he breathed, the name a strange and painful thing on his tongue. But it wasn't his sister's name he was seeing. It was his mother's face, contorting in a mask of agony and hope so extreme it seemed to tear her apart. Her grip on Clara's wrist went slack as her other hand flew to her chest. A choked, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of a wound 30 years old being ripped open anew. Her eyes rolled back in her head. "Mother!" Julian lunged forward, but he was too late. Eleanor Vance, the untouchable matriarch of a New York dynasty, slumped sideways in the booth, a marionette with its strings snipped. Julian's desperate grasp only managed to send a wine glass shattering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the suddenly silent restaurant. Chaos erupted. A woman at the next table screamed. Chairs scraped against the polished floor. And through it all, Clara Mayhew stood motionless, her wrist still tingling from the old woman's grip. The silver locket suddenly feeling as heavy as an anchor, dragging her down into a life that was not her own. Her simple, ticking world had just exploded into a million unrecognizable pieces. The aftermath was a blur of controlled panic. The restaurant staff, trained for any contingency from a dropped fork to a terrorist attack, moved with chilling efficiency. A 911 call was placed. A path was cleared. Paramedics in dark blue uniforms materialized, their urgent, clipped voices speaking a language of vitals and EKGs that felt alien to Clara. They surrounded Eleanor, their movements a stark contrast to her sudden, terrifying stillness. Julian stood beside them, a statue carved from ice, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders at his own security and medical teams. His gaze, however, kept snapping back to Clara, a look of profound confusion, suspicion, and a sliver of something she couldn't name, something that looked dangerously like fear. Clara was gently but firmly guided away by the restaurant manager, a man named Jean-Pierre, whose usual Gallic unflappability had been replaced by a pale, sweaty sheen. He escorted her to his office, a small, cramped room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and anxiety. "Just stay here, Clara," he said, his accent thick. "The police will need a statement. Do not speak to anyone else. Comprenez?" She nodded, sinking into a worn leather chair, her body finally beginning to tremble. The locket felt like it was burning a hole in her skin. She unclasped it, its familiar weight now a source of dread, and held it in her clammy palm. It was just a thing, a piece of silver. How could it do that? A man in a suit that cost more than her car entered the office without knocking. He was tall, with prematurely gray hair, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He radiated an aura of quiet, lethal competence. "Miss Mayhew," he said. It wasn't a question. "My name is David Davies. I am chief counsel for Vance Capital. I need to ask you a few questions." His questions were precise, methodical, and stripped of all emotion. Her name, her age. How long had she worked at Aurelia? Did she know the Vances? Had she ever approached them before? The implication was clear. He was searching for the angle, the con, the shakedown. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I just served them. She saw my necklace." "The necklace," Davies repeated, his eyes flicking to the locket in her hand. "May I?" Reluctantly, she handed it over. He examined it with the dispassionate air of a scientist studying a specimen. He took a photo of it with his phone. "Where did you acquire this?" "It was my father's," she said, the words catching in her throat. "He gave it to me. He said it was with me when he found me." "When he found you?" Davy's eyebrow arched a fraction of an inch. Clara's story tumbled out. The church steps, the kind watchmaker, her life in foster care until Daniel had officially adopted her when she was 10. It was a story she had told a dozen times to social workers and therapists. But saying it now, in this context, felt different. It felt like an alibi. Davies listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He handed the locket back, along with a crisp business card. "Mrs. Vance is being transported to Lenox Hill Hospital. She is stable. We will be in touch. Until then, you will speak to no one about this. Not your friends, not the press. Is that understood?" The command was wrapped in the silk of a request, but it was an iron fist nonetheless. She was sent home in a black car that materialized at the restaurant's service entrance. The ride through the glittering streets of Manhattan felt like a journey through a foreign country. She was dropped at the curb of her modest Brooklyn building, the black car melting back into the night like a phantom. Her best friend and roommate, Sarah, a freelance graphic designer with a perpetually paint-stained sweatshirt, found her an hour later, sitting in the dark, staring at the wall. "Clara, what the hell?" Jean-Pierre called, said there was a medical emergency and you got sent home. "You look like you've been mugged by a ghost." Clara told her everything. The Vances, the grip, the impossible question, the collapse. She held out the locket. Sarah took it, her designer's eye appreciating its craftsmanship. "Whoa, where did you get my daughter's necklace?" That's next level heavy. Are you okay?" "I don't know what I am," Clara confessed, rubbing her temples. "The way he looked at me, Sarah. The son, Julian Vance. It wasn't just, who is this crazy waitress upsetting my mother? It was like he was seeing something that terrified him." The next 3 days were a masterclass in controlled information. Not a whisper of Eleanor Vance's collapse made it into the papers. The official story, for the few who needed one, was a minor health scare, handled privately. The Vance publicity machine was a formidable thing. Clara was placed on a paid leave of absence from Aurelia. The money appeared in her bank account without explanation. It was both a relief and a threat. Hush money. The call from David Davies came on the 4th day. He requested a meeting. Not at his office, but in a private suite at the Carlisle Hotel. The location itself was a message. This was off the books. This was serious. Against Sarah's warnings, this feels like the opening scene of a movie where the girl ends up disappeared. Clara went. She wore her nicest dress, a simple navy blue sheath that made her feel more like a job applicant than a key player in a billionaire's crisis. The suite was a world of hushed tones and old money, with a view of Central Park that looked like a painting. Julian Vance was standing by the window, his back to her. He looked less like the titan of finance and more like a soldier on guard duty. He turned as she entered, and his icy blue eyes held a new emotion, a grudging, weary curiosity. He looked exhausted. "Miss Mayhew," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Thank you for coming." "How is your mother?" Clara asked, the question feeling strangely inadequate. "Resting, and asking for you." The words seemed to cost him something to admit. He gestured to a small mahogany table where the locket sat, looking insignificant beneath the light of a crystal lamp. "Our jewelers have examined it. It's a custom piece, unique. The celestial chart on the front matches the star alignment on the night of September 12th, 30 years ago." He paused, his gaze boring into her. "The night my sister was born." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "My sister Amelia," Julian continued, his voice tight, "disappeared when she was 17. She took a weekend trip to our family's country house in the Hamptons. She never came back. Her car was found abandoned on a service road a mile away. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note. She just vanished." The pain in his voice was so deeply buried it was almost undetectable, but Clara heard it. It was the low hum of a foundational crack in the man's soul. "We spent millions," he said, turning back to the window. "Hired the best investigators in the world. We chased down every lead, every psychic, every cruel hoax. After 5 years, the police declared her legally dead. My father passed away a decade ago, never recovering. My mother, she has never stopped looking." He fell silent, the weight of his family's tragedy filling the opulent room. "What does this have to do with me?" Clara asked, her own voice barely a whisper. Julian turned back, his expression a conflict of raw hope and hardened skepticism. "My mother believes you are Amelia's daughter, that she was pregnant when she disappeared, that she somehow left you, and that locket to be found." The air left Clara's lungs. The idea was so preposterous, so ludicrously cinematic, it felt like a fever dream. That's impossible. I was born in New York. My adoptive father, found me." "And your biological parents?" Davy's smooth voice cut in from the doorway. He had been standing there silently the entire time. "The official record is a blank slate. Jane Doe infant, found abandoned. No birth certificate, no medical records. You, Miss Mayhew, officially do not exist before October 1st, 30 years ago." He stepped forward, holding a file. "The date you were found was 3 weeks after my sister disappeared." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Daniel, of the empty space in her life that represented her origins. It had always been a dull ache, a question without an answer. Now they were presenting an answer so immense it threatened to swallow her whole. "We want to conduct a DNA test," Julian said, his voice suddenly direct, all business. "Discreetly, medically certified, a simple cheek swab from you and my mother." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "We are, of course, prepared to compensate you for this disruption," Davies added, his tone implying the crudeness of discussing money was a necessary evil. "We will place $1 million in an account of your choosing upon your agreement to the test. It is yours to keep, regardless of the outcome. A gesture of goodwill for the distress this has caused." $1 million. The number was so abstract it had no meaning. It was a phone number, not a sum of money. It was a way out of debt, a new life for her and Sarah, the ability to open the clock repair shop she and Daniel had always dreamed of. It was a golden ticket to a different universe. "And if," Clara managed to say, her throat dry, "if it's a match?" Julian Vance looked at her, and for the first time, the icy wall in his eyes cracked, revealing the desolate landscape behind it. "If it's a match," he said, his voice ragged with an emotion he had suppressed for decades. "Then you will be my niece, and you will be a Vance, and I will burn the world to the ground to find out what happened to my sister." It wasn't just an offer, it was a declaration of war, a war he wanted to enlist her in. The price of admission was her identity. The prize was a family, a history, and an answer to the question that had haunted her entire life. But it was also an invitation into the heart of their tragedy, into a world of immense, suffocating power and a sorrow so deep it had broken a dynasty. She looked from Julian's tormented face to Davy's impassive one. The gilded cage was open, and they were waiting to see if she would fly in. "I need some time," she stammered. 48 hours, Julian said, his voice firm again, the mask of control snapping back into place. "Davies will draw up the agreement. We'll await your call." Clara walked out of the Carlisle and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling as though she had just stepped out of a spaceship. The familiar noise of the city seemed distant and muffled. In her pocket was a business card that was either a lifeline or a death sentence. The steady, comforting rhythm of her life was gone. In its place was the frantic, terrifying ticking of a bomb. The 48 hours Julian had allotted her were a period of suspended animation. Clara moved through her life like a ghost, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. The $1 million offer was a siren's call, a seductive melody that promised to solve every mundane problem that plagued her existence. Rent, student loans, the constant, low-grade anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, it would all vanish. She could finally open her shop, the Mayhew Horological, a tribute to Daniel, a space where she could dedicate her life to the quiet, precise art she loved. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, was floored. $1 million, Clara? Just for a DNA test? Take it. Take it and run. Who cares if it's a match? It's a lottery ticket you didn't even have to buy. "It's not about the money, Sarah," Clara said, pacing the worn floor of their living room. "Don't you see? If I do this, and it's a match, I'm not Clara Mayhew anymore. I'm someone else. I'm part of their story, their tragedy." "You've always wanted to know your story," Sarah countered gently. "You've spent your whole life with a book where the first chapter is ripped out. Maybe this is it. Maybe they're your first chapter." The thought was both terrifying and undeniably alluring. To have a history, a lineage, a grandmother, an uncle, a mother who had looked at her with fierce, heartbreaking love in a photograph she'd never seen. On the final morning, she stood before the workbench Daniel had built, running her fingers over the familiar scratches and nicks in the wood. She picked up a delicate pair of tweezers, the tool feeling like an extension of her own hand. Daniel had taught her patience, observation, and the importance of looking for the smallest, most insignificant detail, the tiny misaligned gear, the speck of dust on a jewel pivot that could bring an entire machine to a grinding halt. "The big problems," he'd often said, "always start with a secret you're not seeing." This was a secret she couldn't ignore. With a deep breath that felt like a plunge into icy water, she called David Davies and agreed. The process was as sterile and discreet as a state secret. A doctor with a kind face and solemn eyes met her and Eleanor Vance in a private wing of the hospital. Eleanor looked smaller, more fragile than she had in the restaurant, but her eyes shone with a desperate, radiant hope that was painful to witness. She reached out and squeezed Clara's hand, her touch surprisingly warm. "Whatever the truth is, my dear," she whispered, "thank you for this." The swabs were taken, sealed in biohazard bags with anonymous barcodes, and dispatched by a special courier to a high-security genetics lab in another state. The results, Davies informed them, would take 5 to 7 business days. During that week, Clara's world shifted in subtle, unnerving ways. The $1 million, as promised, appeared in her bank account. Staring at the 7-figure number on her banking app felt like looking at a page of hieroglyphics. It was a language she didn't understand. At Julian's insistence, conveyed through Davies, she was moved from her apartment to a long-term suite at a discreet luxury hotel. The official reason was privacy and security to shield her from any potential media leaks. It felt more like being placed in a gilded holding cell. A new character entered the drama, Arthur Finch. He was introduced as Julian's godfather and a lifelong friend of the Vance family, a senior partner at a rival investment firm. He visited the hotel suite one afternoon, ostensibly to offer support. He was a handsome man in his late 60s, with a warm, avuncular smile and silver hair that fell in a charming sweep across his forehead. "My dear girl," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "this must be an absolute whirlwind for you." Eleanor is convinced, of course. She has a mother's intuition. But Julian, he is more cautious, protective. He smiled conspiratorially. He has a lot of his father in him, always suspecting a wolf in sheep's clothing. Please don't take it personally. His words were kind, but something about his eyes, a fleeting coolness, put Clara on edge. He asked about her life, about Daniel, about the locket. "Such a tragic story," he murmured, shaking his head. "To think of poor Amelia, alone and pregnant. It's a miracle you survived, a true miracle." But the more he spoke, the more a strange feeling crept over Clara. It was a feeling she knew from her work, the sense of a mechanism that was beautifully polished on the outside but had a single jarring note in its rhythm, a wheel that was just a fraction of a millimeter out of true. The unsettling feeling intensified over the next few days. It began with small things. A black SUV parked across the street that seemed to be there whenever she looked out the window. The sense that a conversation she was having on the phone had a faint, almost imperceptible echo. She mentioned it to the plainclothes security guard stationed in her hallway. He was polite, dismissive, assuring her the hotel's security was ironclad. Then came the break-in. Sarah called her, frantic. Their apartment had been burglarized. "It's the weirdest thing, Clara," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They didn't take my laptop or the TV. They took your dad's old work journals, those leather-bound books you keep on the shelf, and some of his tools. That's it. Why would anyone steal that?" Clara's blood ran cold. The journals were filled with Daniel's notes, diagrams, and observations on the thousands of timepieces he had repaired over his 50-year career. They were worthless to anyone else. It wasn't a robbery, it was a search. Someone was looking for something specific, something related to her father's work. She immediately thought of the locket. Had Daniel written about it? She couldn't remember. She told Davies about the break-in. His reaction was immediate and grave. Within the hour, he was at her hotel, accompanied by a grim-faced security consultant. "This changes things," Davies said, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. "This is no longer a simple matter of identity. Someone knows who you are, Miss Mayhew, and they are trying to either find something or erase something connected to your past." Julian Vance arrived minutes later. The news of the targeted burglary had transformed his skepticism into cold fury. The threat was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was aimed at the young woman who might be his family. "They took her father's journals?" he demanded, pacing the suite. "What the hell were they looking for?" "I don't know," Clara said, her mind racing. "He worked on thousands of pieces. He kept detailed notes on everything. Maker's marks, repairs, client histories." She trailed off, an idea sparking in her mind. "Client histories," she repeated. Maybe they weren't looking for notes on the locket. Maybe they were looking for notes on whoever brought the locket to him. The thought was a chilling one. Daniel had always been discreet. That night, unable to sleep, Clara sat with a sketchbook, her mind whirring. She drew the locket from memory, her fingers tracing the celestial map on its surface. Then, using her phone, she cross-referenced the star chart Julian had mentioned. September 12th, 30 years ago. It was a perfect match. But as she zoomed in on the high-resolution photo Davies had sent her, her horologist's eye, trained to spot the infinitesimal, caught something. It was a tiny, almost invisible mark near the clasp. Not a flaw, but a deliberate inscription. It wasn't a jeweler's hallmark she recognized. It was more like a signature, a tiny stylized bird in flight. It was a maker's mark. The day the DNA results were scheduled to arrive, the air in the hotel suite was thick with a suffocating tension. Eleanor was there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Julian stood by the window, a monolith of controlled anxiety. Clara felt like she was waiting for a verdict that would sentence her to one of two completely different lives. Davy's phone rang. He answered, his face an unreadable slate. He listened, said a quiet, "I understand," and hung up. He turned to face them, taking a slow, deliberate breath. His gaze settled on Clara. "The lab has confirmed the results," he said, his voice even. "The mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line, is a direct, undisputed match between Eleanor Vance and Clara Mayhew." He paused, letting the words land with the force of a physical blow. "The probability of relation is 99.99999%. There is no doubt." He looked directly at Clara, his professional demeanor softening for the first time. "You are Amelia Vance's daughter." A strangled sob broke from Eleanor's lips. It was a sound of 30 years of agony and hope released in a single, shattering exhalation. She rose on trembling legs and enveloped Clara in a fierce hug, weeping into her shoulder. "My granddaughter," she cried, the words muffled. "My little girl's baby." Julian staggered back a step, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. The truth, now that it was here, was more overwhelming than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just an uncle. He was the protector of the last living piece of his sister. But as Clara held the weeping old woman, her own mind was racing past the emotional reunion. The DNA was a fact. Her identity was a fact, which meant the danger was also a fact. The break-in, the surveillance. It wasn't random. It was because she was Amelia's daughter. And in that moment of stunning clarity, another piece clicked into place. The maker's mark on the locket. The tiny bird. She had seen it before. Not in person, but in one of Daniel's journals. One of the few old faded ones the thieves had missed, tucked away in a box of spare parts. It was the mark of a very specific, very niche artisan who specialized in custom pieces with hidden compartments and mechanisms. An artisan Daniel had admired for his ingenuity. An artisan who, according to Daniel's notes, had done some private work for one of his other high-profile clients in the early 90s. She pulled away from Eleanor, her heart pounding with a new, terrifying certainty. She looked from Julian's stunned face to Davy's calculating one. "Someone else knew," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Someone else knew who I was, or who I might be, long before I walked into that restaurant. The man who stole my father's journals. He wasn't looking for the history of the locket." "Then what was he looking for?" Julian demanded. Clara looked him straight in the eye. "He was looking for the name of the man who commissioned it." She took a deep breath. "And I think I know whose name he was trying to find. Arthur Finch." The name dropped into the stunned silence of the room, like a stone into a deep, dark well. Arthur Finch, Julian's godfather, the family's trusted friend, the man who had offered her his warm, avuncular sympathy just days ago. The rhythm of his kindness had felt wrong, out of true, and now she knew why. He wasn't just a part of the story. He was the secret that was about to bring the whole machine to a grinding halt. Julian's first reaction was a visceral, angry denial. "Arthur? That's insane. He's family. He loved Amelia." "Did he?" Clara countered, her voice gaining strength. The years spent tracing the intricate logic of clockwork mechanisms had honed her mind for this kind of thinking, connecting disparate, hidden pieces. The artisan who made this locket, the one with the bird maker's mark, my father had notes on him. He was a specialist. He made puzzle boxes, mechanical curiosities. He also did private commissions for a very select clientele. According to my father's journal, one of those clients was Arthur Finch. David Davies, who had been listening with rapt attention, immediately pulled out his phone. "What's the artisan's name?" "Elias Thorne," Clara said without hesitation. "No relation," she added, nodding at Davies. "My father called him the Ghost because he was so reclusive." While Davies made a call, Julian stared at Clara, his face a battleground of doubt and a horrifying dawning suspicion. Why would Arthur commission a locket for Amelia's birth? My father handled that. Maybe your father didn't, Clara posited, the theory forming rapidly in her mind. Maybe Arthur had it made as a personal gift, a gift that could be traced back to him. When my mother disappeared, and I was left with only that locket, it became the one piece of evidence connecting him to her last days. For 30 years, it was just a piece of jewelry on an anonymous orphan. But the moment your mother recognized it, it became a ticking bomb. He needed to know what my father knew. He needed to get those journals to see if Daniel had ever made a record of who might have brought an infant in a locket to his shop 30 years ago. Davies hung up his phone, his face grim. Elias Thorne passed away 5 years ago, but his son runs the business. He confirms his father was commissioned by Arthur Finch in 1993 to create a custom silver locket with a celestial map, a gift for a dear friend's daughter. He also said it was a peculiar commission. Finch insisted it have an unusual clasp, one that required a very specific trick to open. Clara's fingers went to the locket, which she now wore again, a talisman of her past. She had fumbled with the clasp 1,000 times. It was finicky, difficult. She examined it now with a horologist's eye, not a wearer's. It wasn't just a hook and loop, it was a sequence. A tiny, almost invisible series of pins had to be depressed in the right order. Pushing, turning, sliding. With a soft click, a sound she had never heard before, the locket sprang open. It was not what she expected. There were no tiny portraits inside. One side was empty, polished silver. The other contained not a picture, but a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. With trembling hands using the fine-tipped tweezers from the repair kit she now carried in her purse, Clara carefully extracted and unfolded it. It was a luggage storage claim ticket, a ticket for a locker at Grand Central Terminal, dated 3 days after her mother disappeared. The drive downtown was a silent, high-tension procession. Julian, Clara, and 2 of Vance Capital's most formidable security guards moved through the city in a black Escalade. The weight of what they might find hung heavy in the air. Arthur Finch had been placed under discreet surveillance, but he was a powerful man with eyes and ears everywhere. They were moving against the clock. At Grand Central, Davies met them with the terminal manager and a security detail. They were led to a dusty, forgotten corner of the luggage storage area. Locker 734. A locksmith opened the old lock with a groan of protesting metal. Inside was a single worn leather satchel. Julian lifted it out as if it were a holy relic. Back in the sterile security of the Escalade, he opened it. The contents were a time capsule from a life cut short, a worn copy of On the Road, a handful of cassette tapes, The Cure, The Smiths, a faded photograph of a young, handsome man who was clearly not Julian's father, and a small leather-bound diary. Julian's hands shook as he opened the diary. Amelia's youthful, looping script filled the pages. He read aloud, his voice cracking. The later entries were filled with a growing sense of fear and paranoia. Arthur is not who he says he is, he read. He's been at the country house all week. He says he's helping Dad with the firm's accounts, but he looks at me. It's not right. He followed me into town today. I feel trapped. The final entry was scrawled in a frantic, terrified hand. I found it. Dad's study. A second set of books. Arthur is stealing from the company. Millions. He's been doing it for years. It's not just theft. It's something bigger. Names I don't recognize. Offshore accounts. He caught me. He knows I know. He grabbed me. His eyes, they weren't kind, Uncle Arthur's eyes. They were a stranger's. He said we were going to take a drive, that I needed to be kept safe, where no one could find me. He took my keys. I'm scared. I told him I was pregnant. I thought it would stop him. He just smiled, a terrible smile. He said, even better, a fresh start for all of us. Julian's voice broke. He couldn't continue. Amelia hadn't run away. She had been taken by the man who had been a second father to him, the man who had stood at his own father's graveside and delivered a eulogy about loyalty. Clara took the diary, her heart aching for the terrified teenage mother she'd never known. Her existence hadn't been an accident or a moment of passion. She had been a weapon used against her own mother. Then a sudden, horrifying realization dawned on her. The locket, she whispered, her blood turning to ice. The secret clasp. My mother wouldn't have known how to open it. It wasn't for her. It was for him. He put the claim ticket in there. After he got rid of her. He left me on the church steps with the one thing that implicated him, but it was locked away inside a puzzle only he could solve. A sick joke. A trophy. Julian's face was a mask of pure murderous rage. "Where is he?" he snarled at his head of security. The answer came a second later, crackling over the guard's earpiece. "Sir, the surveillance team lost him. His car is heading north, out of the city. We also just got a security alert from the Vance estate. An unauthorized access code was just used at the main gate. Your mother's code." Arthur wasn't running. He was going to the one person left who represented his 30-year lie. He was going to Eleanor. He was going to finish it. The race to the Vance estate in Westchester was a frantic 90-mile-per-hour blur. Julian was on the phone, coordinating with state police, his voice a blade of cold fury. Clara sat beside him, the diary clutched in her hand, her mind whirring, trying to think, trying to find a move in a game where the board had been suddenly, violently upended. Her mother had been trapped. Now, her grandmother was. "He'll take her somewhere," Julian said, thinking aloud. "Somewhere quiet. Isolate her. The old boathouse? The stables?" Clara's mind flashed to her own work, to the intricate hidden world of clocks, to secrets hidden in plain sight. "No," she said, a sudden, chilling intuition taking hold. "He'll take her somewhere that means something to him. Somewhere he felt powerful. Somewhere he felt safe." She remembered his visit, the way he'd spoken of Julian's father with that strange mix of reverence and resentment. "He'll take her to your father's study." When they screeched to a halt in the gravel driveway of the sprawling stone mansion, the house looked peaceful, undisturbed, but Julian knew better. He led a silent, armed team through a side entrance, moving with a predator's grace through the halls of his childhood home. They found them in the library, a grand two-story room lined with thousands of books and dominated by a massive fireplace. Eleanor was seated in a wingback chair, her face ashen. Arthur Finch stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder in a grotesque parody of comfort. A small silver pistol sat on the table beside him, looking both elegant and obscene. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice calm, conversational. "I was just telling your mother how this unfortunate business will finally be put to rest." He smiled at Clara. "And the little horologist. You have your mother's cleverness. A pity she didn't have your luck." "It's over, Arthur," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. His security team fanned out, their weapons trained on him. Arthur laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "It was over 30 years ago, my boy. I gave your father's company everything. I built it with him. But he was always the name. Vance. I was just the friend, the confidant. And Amelia, she was just like him, poking her nose where it didn't belong." He sighed. "She was a loose end, and I am a man who ties up his loose ends." His gaze shifted to Eleanor, his expression softening into something possessive and cruel. "I should have been the one to take care of you, Eleanor. Not him. It should have been me." He reached for the pistol. In that split second, as the world slowed to a crawl, Clara's eyes darted around the room. Her gaze landed on the magnificent grandfather clock in the corner, a massive, ornate piece by a famed 18th century clockmaker. Daniel had a photo of it in one of his journals. The Vance clock, a masterpiece of engineering, famous for its complexity and for its secret. Daniel's voice echoed in her memory. "They say the old man, your great-grandfather, was paranoid, built a silent alarm into the clockwork, a specific sequence in the chime train that, when tripped, would lock down the room. It was an insane 1 in a million chance. As Arthur's fingers closed around the gun, Clara screamed, 'The fire poker!' It was a meaningless distraction, but it made everyone, including Arthur, flinch and look toward the fireplace for a split second. In that instant, Clara lunged, not at Arthur, but at the clock. She didn't have the key, but she didn't need it. Her fingers found a small, concealed button hidden in the ornate carvings on the side. A manual override for the chime sequence, a detail Daniel had circled in his notes. She pressed it. There was no loud alarm. Instead, a deep, resonant whirring sound filled the room, the sound of ancient, powerful gears engaging. Heavy steel shutters concealed within the wood-paneled walls slammed down over the windows. A thick slab of steel descended from the ceiling, sealing the massive double doors to the library. The room was plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by a few dim lamps. They were sealed in a vault. Arthur stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "What have you done?" "My grandfather was a cautious man," Julian said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. The tactical advantage had shifted. Arthur was no longer a man with a gun in an open room. He was a rat in a steel trap. The standoff was short and brutal. In the enclosed space, Arthur's desperation made him reckless. He fired a single wild shot that shattered a porcelain vase before Julian's team subdued him. In the ringing silence that followed, as Arthur was restrained and the emergency override was keyed in to raise the lockdown, Clara sank to the floor, her body trembling with adrenaline. Eleanor rushed to her side not as a matriarch, but as a grandmother, her arms wrapping around Clara in a protective embrace. Julian knelt before them, his eyes finding Clara's. The ice in his gaze was gone, replaced by a profound, humbled respect. "You saved her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us both." Clara looked up at the great clock, its pendulum swinging in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The secret it had held for a century had saved them. Daniel had been right. The big problems, the big secrets, could always be solved if you just knew how the pieces fit together. She wasn't just a part of their story anymore. She was the one who had finally set its timing right. The resolution was not a storybook ending, but a slow, painful, and ultimately healing dawn. Arthur Finch's confession, prompted by the undeniable evidence from Amelia's diary, painted a sordid picture of jealousy, greed, and sociopathic narcissism. His empire crumbled, and he was sentenced to life in prison, a forgotten ghost in the system he once manipulated. The legal proceedings were protracted, a media storm that the Vance family weathered with a newfound, united stoicism. But the private healing was a far more complex mechanism to repair. Eleanor, freed from the limbo of not knowing, began to truly live again, but her joy was forever laced with the sorrow of her daughter's stolen life. Julian, stripped of his cynical armor, had to learn how to be not just a CEO, but a brother in mourning and an uncle to a young woman who was both a stranger and flesh of his flesh. Clara did not melt seamlessly into the Vance dynasty. She was offered a life of unimaginable luxury, a trust fund that could last 10 lifetimes, a penthouse overlooking the park, a seat on the board of the family's philanthropic foundation. She accepted the resources, but refused to be subsumed by the name. She took a portion of the money and finally opened her shop in a quiet, sunlit corner of Greenwich Village. She named it the Amelia. It was a place of quiet focus, filled with the scent of brass and oil and the gentle, constant ticking of 100 different heartbeats. It was her sanctuary, a connection to both the father who raised her and the mother she never knew. She spent weekends at the estate in Westchester, slowly, cautiously building a relationship with her family. She and Julian found a quiet understanding, a bond forged in crisis, and a shared meticulous way of looking at the world. He would often sit in her workshop, watching in silent fascination as she reassembled a complex 18th century automaton or regulated the beat of a vintage Patek Philippe. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after that fateful night at Aurelia, Julian brought a heavy dust-sheeted object into her workshop. It was the great-grandfather clock from the library. "It hasn't kept proper time since that night," he said quietly. "It's running slow. I thought, maybe you could look at it." Clara smiled, a genuine, easy smile. She ran her hand over the polished wood, her fingers tracing the carvings that hid the secret that had saved them. It was more than a clock. It was a legacy, a survivor, a witness. It was family. "Of course," she said, picking up her tools. "Let's see if we can get it running right again." As she opened the clock's face, the low afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching the silver locket at her throat. It didn't feel like an anchor anymore. It felt like a compass. It had led her here, to this quiet room, to this new, complicated, and finally complete life, where the past and the future were ticking along in perfect, harmonious time.